Hi, dear friends. All right, we are now in number 2 of our 3-part series, The Forgotten Characters of the Fellowship of the Ring. We're going to talk about Glorfindel. Glorfindel was an elf lord, and we're asking the question, can an elf lord teach us how to see into the spiritual realm? So check out our presentation discussion around Glorfindel. Today, we're going to dive into a story that we are spirit beings living in the physical world, or how Glorfindel, how an ancient elf can help us see the world with different eyes. So this story starts the way we're going to tell it today with this scene on a place called Weathertop. Frodo and these hobbits are up on this ancient ruined tower, and they get attacked by 5 Nazgul. And a Nazgul is a wraith, or some being that used to be human that slowly became sort of this transparent, spiritual, ghosty creature, right? So these 5 Nazgul, these 5 wraiths, they all begin to attack the hobbits. Somebody comes to the rescue. Does anybody remember who that is? Strider. They don't quite yet know who Strider is, but he does rescue them and stops the Nazgul and scares them off. But before he does that, one of the Nazgul, we later find out he's actually the Witch King, the most powerful one, pulls out a little dagger and is able to stab Frodo, because Frodo puts on the ring and he can see Frodo, and then bam. To everyone else, Frodo's invisible when he wears the ring. But guess what? The wraiths exist mostly in this other spirit world. And so as soon as Frodo puts on the ring, they can see him easier. So Frodo actually revealed himself by putting the ring on, and then he gets stabbed by this Witch King. Now, something weird starts to happen to Frodo. It doesn't kill him, but there's a little piece of the dagger inside of him, like kind of making its way to his heart. And something happens to his eyes. And the movie actually does a good job of this. Like, you see this picture, something's happening to his ability to see. And this is really important. So for us to understand how Tolkien is going to describe how physical and the spiritual world collide, we have to ask the question, what is going on with Frodo's eyes? His eyes are starting to move more into the spirit world than into the physical world. That's what's happening, right? So he suddenly is be able to perceive. Now, you don't really know what's going on with his eyes at this point in the story or in the movie. And we're going to follow the movie for a minute. The next thing that happens is they're running away from they're getting hunted by these Nazgul. Strider is leading them. They get further and further closer to safety, which is this house called Rivendell. They're trying to get to Rivendell. That's the only way that Frodo can get healed from the stab wound he has. So they're running and running and running. And in the movie, what happens in this scene is that Frodo sees Arwen like this, but she actually, in the physical world, looks like this. So what Frodo sees is this glowing person with this white dress on, when in reality, with her hair down, her hair is back, and she's wearing some kind of riding outfit. And the question that you have to ask is, what is Frodo seeing? Why does he see this when in reality, or the better question maybe to ask is, which is more real? Which Arwen is more real? I think what Frodo sees is actually more real. And so the other hobbits, they just see there's this elf woman that appeared out of nowhere that's a rider. But Frodo suddenly sees something much deeper, because she's incredibly powerful. And so he sees a lot of that in this sort of glowing. Now, that's the movie. Anybody who's read the books, you're immediately getting a little frustrated with this story, right? Because in reality, in the story, they meet Glorfindel. Okay, so I'll read for you guys this part of the story. So they're on the road, and they're trying to run away from these black riders. They're being hunted, and all of a sudden, they hear like horse hooves coming. They're thinking the black riders are finally caught up to them. Okay, and so this is where we pick up the story. It says, "That does not sound like a black rider's horse," said Frodo, listening intently. Oops. Suddenly into view below came a white horse, gleaming in the shadows, running swiftly. In the dusk, its headstall flickered and flashed as if it were studded with gems like living stars. To Frodo, it appeared that a white light was shining through the form and raiment of the rider, as if through a thin veil. So this is why in the movie they show Arwen that way. Because when Frodo first sees Glorfindel, he sees him as this glowing elf. When he saw Strider being the elf, he dismounted and ran to meet him, calling out, is anybody's Elvish? Anybody want to, like, we're getting really nerdy. Okay, I don't know how to say this. Aina Vindui Dunedain Me Govanen. Yeah, I don't know. That's close. His speech and clear ringing voice left no doubt in their hearts. The rider was of the elven folk. No others that dwelt in the wide world had voices so fair to hear, but there seemed to be a note of haste or fear in his call,
and they saw that he was now speaking quickly and urgently to Strider. So they see this glowing elf lord. They're like, okay, well, this is great. Frodo, of course, sees more because his eyes are changing, sees more of who Glorfindel is. Glorfindel is like, wow, like someone very, very powerful, not just a normal elf. They end up putting Frodo on Glorfindel's horse, and they tell Frodo, go to the ford. And so they're trying to get Frodo to the ford of the river. Now, when Glorfindel puts Frodo on the horse, Frodo does not move. He's being commanded by the Black Riders to stay, because they are getting more and more power over him as he's moving into the spirit world. As this injury he has, this like little piece of the dagger of the Witch King, as it gets more and more control over Frodo, he's sort of falling more and more into their world and under their direction. And so the elf then, instead of talking to Frodo, because Frodo won't listen to him, he talks to the horse and tells the horse, in Elvish, like, get him to Rivendell. And so the horse just boom explodes, gets to the ford, and crosses the ford just before he's cut off by the 9 Nazgul. All 9 of the Nazgul, these horrible Black Riders, these wraiths, are chasing Frodo all the way to the ford. Frodo barely gets across, and then you read this. He suddenly stops at the other side of the ford. So he's on the other side of the river, and he says this. He says, "Go back," he cried. "Go back to the land of Mordor and follow me no more." His voice sounded thin and shrill in his own ears. The riders halted, but Frodo had not the power of Bombadil. His enemies laughed at him with a harsh and chilling laughter. Come back, they called. "To Mordor we will take you." Then the leader, who was now half across the ford, stood up, menacing in his stirrups, and raised up his hand. Frodo was stricken dumb. He felt his tongue cleave to his mouth, and his heart laboring, his sword broke and fell out of his shaking hand. So this Witch King cast a spell on Frodo, and Frodo suddenly was almost killed by this spell. Part of it is because he has this piece of the Witch King's dagger inside of him, right? So it looks like all hope is lost, right? It looks like the Nazgul are going to get a hold of Frodo and take the ring back. And then we read, "At that moment there came a roaring and rushing of noise of loud water rolling many stones. Dimly Frodo saw the river below him rise, and down along its course there came a plumed cavalry of waves." So you have this sudden flood that is commanded by the elves to protect their house, and so it starts to hit these Black Riders. Now the next scene, this is the moment for me when I was in 7th grade and first reading this story that like really blew my mind, and this is what I want to really kind of zero in on. What happens next is really crazy. All right, it says this: "With his last failing senses, Frodo heard cries, and it seemed to him that he saw, beyond the riders that hesitated on the shore, a shining figure of white light, and behind it ran small, shadowy forms waving flames that flared red in the gray mist that was falling over the world." So, I remember reading that, and I was like, what did Frodo see? Like that's what kind of fascinated me. Who was this shining creature? All the others, so Strider was there, the hobbits were there. What they had done was they had built a fire, they got these torches, and they decided to force the Black Riders into the river because they knew that the river was going to rise to attack the Black Riders. Glorfindel knew that was coming. And so, but when Frodo looked across the river, everyone was shadowy. Strider was a shadow, the hobbits were a shadow. Glorfindel was this gleaming white light. And so that brings up this question that everybody who reads Lord of the Rings is like, wait a minute, who is Glorfindel? Like, what did Frodo see? Like, what's going on there? And that's really what we want to try to dig into. Now, we're going to get really nerdy because we're going to try to figure out who this guy is. And it's going to take us into the ancient history of Middle-earth. So Glorfindel comes from a place, this is one of my favorite paintings of this place. So Glorfindel comes from this place. Yeah, this is the ancient lost or hidden city of Gondolin. So in the Lord of the Rings, we're at the very end of what's called the Third Age. Every age is like 3,000 or 4,000 years long. This is in the First Age. This is like many, many thousands of years before. There was a powerful city in Middle-earth called Gondolin. It was in a land called Beleriand, And this is the most powerful city you can possibly imagine. Like Sauron, who's the big evil guy in Lord of the Rings, he would not stand a chance against this city. This city would easily destroy Sauron. But there was a much more powerful foe they faced back then called Morgoth. Sauron was one of his servants. Morgoth was much more powerful than Sauron, 10 times more powerful. And and even Morgoth was afraid of this city. This Morgoth was hunting for this city because this city scared him so much. This was the one city that he thought could possibly end in his defeat because it was ruled by a king named Turgon, and Turgon was this incredibly powerful king. He was the head of all the elves in the First Age. Now it was this hidden city surrounded by mountains, and all the swords in the Lord of the Rings, most of the swords, like Sting, you guys remember Sting, Gandalf's sword, Glamdring, Thorin's sword, yeah, Orcus, they were all forged in this city. So a lot of times what's happening in Lord of the Rings is they're discovering the remnants of Gondolin. And one of the remnants of Gondolin is a guy named Glorfindel. Okay, so in Gondolin, there were 12 powerful houses, okay, and they each had their own banner. And the 12 houses all had a leader. So you have the House of the Mole, the Harp, the King, the Hammer of Wrath, the Fountain, the Golden Flower, the Heavenly Arch, the Tree, the White Wing, the Swallow, the Tower of Snow, and the Pillar. Okay, so Glorfindel is the head of this house, which is the House of the Golden Flower. That's who he is. Okay, so all of these elves are insanely powerful in Tolkien's world, and Glorfindel is one of those. Now, one of the things that in the Silmarillion, the story of Gondolin is actually called the Fall of Gondolin, and it's the very first story that Tolkien ever wrote about fantasy, about this world. There were people that escaped the fall of Gondolin, and they were led by an elf named Glorfindel. And so Glorfindel of the House of the Golden Flower was able to get some people out. But the problem is when they went over the pass trying to get the remnants of Gondolin away from the city, they ran into something. They ran into the most powerful Balrog of Morgoth's whole army. So there's a lot of famous paintings of Glorfindel's fight with the Balrog. And one of the things that happens in Tolkien's world is Balrogs, usually when you fight a Balrog, you die. Even Gandalf, I don't know if you guys remember, he didn't make it out alive. And so Balrogs are the most powerful evil creatures in Tolkien's world. And so having Gothmog, this horrible Balrog, he's there standing guard over this pass. He and Glorfindel have this battle, and Glorfindel ends up killing the Balrog. That's how powerful he is. Now he does die as well, and so they both die together, similar to how when Gandalf faced the Balrog in Moria, and they both fell. So what happened though in Tolkien's world is because this was a act of such like heroic valor, what happens to elves when they die is they're immortal beings. Their souls are immortal. They end up going back into the world of Aman, this sort of a world where all the elves originally came from, or where they eventually end up. This is the realm of sort of the where the good kind of angels live. They're called the Valar. Their spirits end up back there, and these Valar, they decide to send Glorfindel back into Middle Earth. And so Glorfindel is a resurrected elf from the First Age. And that's part of what Frodo is seeing. That's what's so interesting about his character. He's this, glowing thing. And so Frodo is, of course, very confused. He's now in Rivendell after having been rescued by Glorfindel. And he's being healed by living in Rivendell. This this half-elf called Elrond is there healing him. And when he wakes up, he has a conversation with Gandalf, and this is a really interesting conversation. He's asking Gandalf about Glorfindel, and Gandalf says, "Here in Rivendell, there live still some of the chief foes, the elven wise, lords of the Eldar, from beyond the furthest seas. They do not fear the ring wraiths, for those who have dwelt in the blessed realm live at once in both worlds, and against both, the seen and the unseen, they have great power." So the Blessed Realm is this place in the West that the most powerful elves came from. And Glorfindel was originally from there before he came to Gondolin. That's where he lived. He comes to Gondolin. He, of course, goes back to the Blessed Realm after he dies, and then he's resurrected and sent back. And so he's from there. And this is what Gandalf is trying to explain to Frodo. So Frodo said, "I thought that I saw a white figure that shone and did not dim like the others. Was that Glorfindel then? Gandalf. Yes, you saw him for a moment, as he is upon the other side, one of the mighty of the firstborn. He is an elf lord of a house of princes. It's kind of as a reference to the house of the golden flower that Glorfindel is over. So we're trying to get like an understanding of like how Tolkien tried to unveil or help us see that there are these two realities that we're always looking at. When you're looking at people, looking at events, you can always look at things from these two perspectives, sort of more of a spiritual perspective or more of a physical perspective. In the next chapter of The Lord of the Rings, when they're in Rivendell and everybody's recovering, and what then Gandalf says, he is not half through yet, and to what he will come in the end, not even Elrond can foretell. So he's talking about Frodo, not to evil, I think. He may become like a glass filled with a clear light for eyes to see that can. One of the things that Gandalf and Elrond started talking about is, will Frodo ever be fully healed after this stab wound? Because it starts to pull him into this spirit world. And what they conclude is, I don't think he's going to turn evil, but he may turn translucent, right? He may become a clear light for eyes to see that can. They're very worried about whether or not Frodo will ever recover from this wound. And in fact, at the end of the story, the story is that Frodo actually never does recover. You can read the whole story how this transpires, but it's a very sad part of the very last chapter of the last book where we hear about like what happens to Frodo because he can't be healed of this wound. So the question we're trying to ask is, do we see people as primarily physical or spiritual when we look into the physical world? And one way to describe this, when we get into how the Bible talks about this conflict, I love asking the question, did the pre-fall Adam and Eve glow? So something happened when Eve ate the fruit and Adam ate the fruit. It said all of a sudden they were surprised that they were naked, and they went and got fig leaves to cover themselves. Why are they covering themselves? What happened to them? What did they see? Now, it's possible they just got guilty and were like, I got to cover myself. It's also possible that something actually happened spiritually or maybe even physically to them. Now, what's the evidence of that? Well, I think the best evidence for the possibility, again, this is just, we're going to like look at this as a possibility. The Bible isn't completely clear on this point, is what happens to Moses, right? So in 2 Corinthians, you guys remember what happened to Moses? He was up on the mountain, and then he comes down and his face is glowing. You guys remember that story? Now, what's really interesting is the veil. Yeah, he puts a veil over his face. Why do you think he put a veil over his face? Like you'd think, oh, I'm trying to be humble. Let me put a veil over my face. No, it was the other way around. He was worried because people would watch it fade, right? And this is what Paul points out in 2 Corinthians. He says, we are not like Moses who would put a veil over his face to prevent the Israelites from seeing the end of what was passing away. We all who with unveiled faces contemplate the Lord's glory are being transformed into his image with ever increasing glory, which comes from the Lord who is the Spirit. So there's some kind of, like when you're in contact with the spiritual reality, like Moses started glowing and then started fading. And this is part of what's interesting about like, okay, what was it like for Adam and Eve to be walking with God in the cool of the day, just being in his presence, being full of his presence, and then all of a sudden committing a sin and then noticing something physically had happened to them and then becoming ashamed of that. Because Moses was ashamed of the fading of his face. That's why he put the veil on. So anyway, I find that really interesting. Like this, we have to start to grapple with the connections between the physical and the spiritual world, how they interact. And I think, again, we're living in an age that doesn't respect this exploration, but this is why I love looking at Tolkien and some of the things he wrote in order to see this. Now, another author, one of J.R.R. Tolkien's best friends, also talked a lot about this. And I think probably the best essay that C.S. Lewis ever wrote is called The Weight of Glory. It's a short essay about how to think about other human beings. Like when you interact with another human being, what exactly are you interacting with? Are you interacting with like an annoying physical overgrown ape, or are you interacting with a powerful spiritual being? Like which is it? What Lewis is trying to describe here is if you start to actually perceive how powerful spiritual beings are, you would feel the weight of their glory. So like people that saw Moses' face shining, they were aware of the weight of his glory, right? In this sort of highfalutin language that Tolkien uses, he tries to unveil the fact that you're interacting with spirit beings that are various kinds of power. And this is what Lewis says. He says, it is a serious thing to live in a society of possible gods and goddesses, to remember that the dullest, most uninteresting person you can talk to may one day be a creature which, if you saw it now, you would be strongly tempted to worship, or else a horror and a corruption such as you now meet, if at all, only in a nightmare. Whoa! Imagine seeing people that way. Like, this is really powerful. This is the weight of glory. There are no ordinary people, Lewis writes. You have never talked to a mere mortal. Nations, cultures, arts, civilizations, these are mortal, and their life is to ours as the life of a gnat. But it is immortals whom we joke with, work with, marry, snub, and exploit, immortal horrors or everlasting splendors. So that's the best description I've ever read in my life of like how to think about human beings if you actually could perceive the spiritual reality, the spirit world, right? So what Frodo was seeing was he was seeing that he saw the horror of these Nazgul, and he saw the glory of Glorfindel. And so Lewis or Tolkien is helping us sort of see this. So what would be different about the world if we saw people this way? When Jesus was, if you guys don't remember, the transfiguration was Jesus was unveiled as his real spiritual self to these three disciples of his. Peter, James, and John were the only ones that saw him in that state. And when they saw him, he was blazing with white light. And this is one of the reasons we believe Jesus is God. Because he, when once revealed in the spirit realm, he was not like another human being. Like he was revealed as God himself on that mountain. And that's why in 1 John, John says, we beheld him like the glory of God when we saw Jesus full of grace and truth. Like that ability to see that. And so, yeah, part of it is we're interacting with people, like you're seeing people descend into hell, becoming these darker and darker and darker beings, or like be elevated into light. Like this is a lot at stake to be able to see these things. In the scriptures, relationships are so important because you're dealing with beings of immense importance, right? So, and this is, another verse that points this out. Paul says, set your mind on things above, not on earthly things, for you died and your life is now hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is your life, appears, then you will appear with him in glory. Again, it's important, he says, right now, when you're talking to another believer, you need to see them as hidden with Christ in glory. Like you are interacting with a being of immense power, immense worth, immense glory already because of who they are in Christ, because they're in Christ. This word in is a big deal. They're with Christ, with Christ, in God. So when you look at people, can you see into the spirit realm? Another way that, and this is something I think we need to really learn, because I think we're told to do this. In 2 Corinthians it says, so we have stopped evaluating others from a human point of view. At one time we thought of Christ merely from a human point of view. How differently we know him now. Like when you think about Christ, your ability to perceive the spiritual realm is so important because you can't, if you perceive him from a human point of view, if Christ himself is a human, then it changes the whole nature of your perception of every other person, including yourself. And there's something so important and so foundational about how we perceive Christ. And so one of the weird things is, I mean, Paul is saying here, he didn't see Christ, he didn't see Jesus as the Messiah, that's the Christ. He did not see the spiritual power of Christ. But one of the things I love about the gospel stories is there were people who saw into the spirit realm when they saw Christ. Do you guys remember? So here's an example. It's important to imagine when Jesus was riding on a colt into the city of Jerusalem, the Pharisees, the priests, the teachers of the law could not recognize that this man was the Messiah. But when Mary and Joseph brought a little baby into a bustling temple courtyard where there's thousands of people, there were two people that could see through the physical realm and recognized who Jesus was as a baby. Isn't that crazy? They saw as a baby, they're like, oh, that's the Messiah. So this is from Luke 2. It says, at that time there was a man in Jerusalem named Simeon. He was righteous and devout and was eagerly waiting for the Messiah to come and rescue Israel. The Holy Spirit was upon him and had revealed to him that he would not die until he had seen the Lord's Messiah. So that day, the Spirit led him to the temple. He was at the right place at the right time with the right eyes. So when Mary and Joseph came to present the baby Jesus to the Lord as the law required, Simeon was there. He took the child in his arms and praised God, saying, "Sovereign Lord, now let your servant die in peace as you have promised. I have seen your salvation, which you have prepared for all people. He is a light to reveal God to the nations, and he is the glory of your people Israel." Jesus' parents were amazed at what was being said about him. Could Mary and Joseph see the glory of Christ in their little baby boy? Yet Simeon could. How weird would it be to have somebody like some old man come and grab your child and say, "Oh, he's here. I can die now. I've seen him." Wow. I mean, that would be really crazy. But that's what happened to Mary and Joseph. And they were like, "What's going on?" And it's interesting what he says here, right? He is a light. Like he sees Jesus as a light for two things. He's going to bring light to the Gentiles, and he's going to be the glory of Israel. There's nothing that gives more glory to Israel than Jesus. I like to tell Jewish people. Like, Jesus is what brought the glory of God to the Gentiles, and he was Jewish. You should claim him. He's amazing. But Simeon was doing that. Like, there is no glory like this baby. Now, so it's interesting. When Frodo was fading, I really like how the movies do this. Like, they show this like very weird, shimmery, like, so in the real world, the Black Riders had like hoods on, right? So they had these black robes. But when Frodo put the ring on, he sees their crowns. The Nazgul were pretty much all kings. That Sauron used these 9 rings of power to enslave them and give them, almost immortal life as wraiths. And so Frodo saw their original state. He saw that they were actually kings from ancient times, but in this weird sort of shadow. And so I just love this image. It's like, oh, he saw it. He saw what they really were, both in their darkness, and he could see Glorfindel's light. This is the verse I really wanted to kind of tease out with you guys for a second before we're done here today. Hebrews 5 says this: "Solid food is for the mature, who because of practice have their senses trained to distinguish between good and evil." So what the author of Hebrews is saying here is mature people, they're mature because their senses have been trained to distinguish good and evil, to detect good and evil, right? So this is what I want to understand. Like how because it sounds like what he's saying is as you grow in maturity, you begin to have this ability that Frodo started to have. You begin to have a sense about people.
All right, guys, I hope you enjoyed that presentation. We are trying to explore some of the deepest stories that really move our souls. And so I am gathering a bunch of people from Cincinnati to give presentations on these deep stories. I think that this is a time for us to really understand the meaning behind stories and have discussions around how beautiful they are, why they move us, and what they actually are trying to communicate to us. And so if you're interested in that kind of thing, please go to storychapelcincy.com. That's where you can find out all the information about what we're doing. Also, you can check us out on Instagram at Story Chapel. This is a big part of what we're trying to understand, how to be formed by these stories, gather a whole community of us together to have discussions around these stories. So if you want to see, we kind of move around, we pop up in different places. We meet at 11:30 on Sunday morning. We'd love to see you there.